ジンが衝撃的な行為に巻き込まれているのを知ったユングクの世界は崩壊する。秘密、執着、そして混沌が渦巻く。緊張感あふれる、手に汗握る物語。ジムが、部屋の中でこんなことが。発見だ、ジム、何をしているんだ。薄暗い部屋から、ユングクの声が無知のように響いた。部屋の明かりが、緊張した静寂を打ち砕いた。その瞬間は凍りついた。時間は重苦しい霧のように漂い、息苦しく、捉えどころがなかった。ジムの顔は青ざめ、驚き、内側からかきむしる罪悪感をかろうじて隠していた。彼の指は、ユングクがまだ理解できない物体の上で彼らは震えていた。部屋は得体の知れない緊張感で重苦しい。ユングクの胸が締め付けられるほどだった。情の蛍光灯がちらつき、不規則な影が踊っていた。壁を越え、見慣れたスタジオをサスペンスの部屋へと変貌させる。ユングクの心臓の鼓動の一つ一つが、胸が戦太鼓のように激しく鳴り響いた。その響きが、胃の奥で渦巻く恐怖をさらに増幅させた。彼の心は、断片的に、信じられない思いが恐怖、怒り、そして圧倒的な裏切り感とぶつかり合った。ジムの目は大きく見開かれ、瞬きもせず。まるで自ら作った檻に閉じ込められているかのように、薄暗い光を反射していた。そんなつもりはないと彼は言いかけたが、言葉は、瞬間の重圧に押しつぶされそうになった。ユングクの視線はジムが見ていた物体へと鋭く移った。現実はまるで肉体的な打撃のように彼を襲い、背筋が震えた。部屋はかすかに焦げた匂いがした。コーヒーと、それよりも鋭い金属的な香り。その香りはユングクの本能を瞬時に覚醒させる。彼の手は、机の端にぎゅっと握りしめ、指の関節が白くなり、もう片方の手は本能的に携帯電話に手を伸ばしたが、ためらいが彼を凍りつかせた。誰かに電話する気にはなれなかった。ただメモだけ、彼は理解する必要があった。彼は、真実、ジムは後ずさりした。床板が罪悪感の重みできしんだ。ヤング、聞いてくれ。彼は震える声で囁いた。しかしユングクは動けなかった。全身全霊で層を掘り起こすことに集中していた。ジムの突然の不可解な行動の背後にあるもの。これはいつもの遊び心のあるいたずらではなかった。それは何か別のもの、もっと暗いもの、何年もかけて築いてきた脆い信頼を壊す恐れのあるものだった。ユングクの心は、共に笑ったこと、秘密の会話、そして傷つきやすい瞬間。それらすべてが、まるでひび割れのように突然汚れてしまったように感じられた。かつて完璧だった鏡。ジムの説明がつまずくにつれ、緊張は高まった。断片、言い訳、そして半分の真実を通してジョングクが想像もしなかった世界を垣間見せる。ジムの温かく親しみやすい笑顔の裏に、この事実が明らかになったことで、ユングクは自分の行動だけでなく、隠された動機、不安、そして秘密の執着が友人の世界を静かに形作ってきた。大きな音がした。部屋の隅からユングクの意識が揺さぶられた。回しっぱなしにしていた小さな扇風機が倒れ、木の床を切る刃が空気を熱く切り裂く。ユングクの脈拍が急上昇した。彼自身の影が大きく浮かび上がった。ひび割れた壁に、まるで感情が形になったかのように歪んで怪物のように映った。彼はそれに気づいた。息もできず、考えることもできず、見たものが信じられなかった。なぜ教えてくれなかったの？ユングク、その声は怒りと信じられない思いが入り混じったものだった。普段は冷静な彼の目は、今はまだ涙が滲んでいた。涙が割れたガラスの破片のように薄暗い光を反射していた。ジムの沈黙は、どんな告白よりも響いた。そうなっていたかもしれない。そしてその静寂の中で、ユングクは自分が知っていると思っていた世界が崩れ去るのを感じた。外の夜は薄い壁に寄りかかり、内部の騒乱には無関心だった。 風が窓ガラスを揺らし、ユングクに秘密を囁いた。まるで宇宙そのものが彼を無防備にし、危険にさらすように仕向けているかのように。彼が名付けることも抵抗することもできない狂気。ユングクは彼の手を握り、背を向けると部屋中に。ジムの行動によってバラバラになった現実の断片をつなぎ合わせようと、落ち着きのないサークルが集まっている。音、あらゆる影、あらゆるかすかな動きが潜在的な脅威となり、アドレナリンの底から奇妙で悲痛な理解がにじみ出てきた。人間は、たとえ親しい友人であっても、未知の世界を宿している可能性がある。それは、たった一度の出来事で大混乱に陥る可能性がある。衝撃的な瞬間、ブラインドの隙間から夜明けの兆しが覗く頃には、ユングクの心は、疑問、恐怖、そしてたった今起こった出来事に立ち向かわなければならないという苛立たしい衝動。不気味なほど静まり返った部屋は、まるで圧迫されているようだった。あらゆる方向から何も元に戻ることはないという警告が突きつけられた。そしてユングクは不安な気持ちでそれを知った。これは始まりに過ぎないと確信していた。ユングクは小さなアパートの中を目的もなく歩き回り、その一歩一歩が緊張の中で不自然に響き渡った。雨に濡れた空間、ブラインドの隙間から差し込む朝日が床に光の筋を走らせ、散らばった書類、つま先たちの椅子、そして今まで気づかなかったコーヒーのかすかな痕跡。すべてが同じ匂いがするが、全く異質だった。ありふれたものが、まるで部屋が、彼自身も昨夜の混乱を吸収していた。彼は窓の前に立ち止まり、街の向こう側を見つめていた。かつては活気に満ち、生き生きとしていたのに、今は曇ったガラス越しに見る絵画の風景のように遠く感じられた。下の通りはいつものように賑やかで、車がクラクションを鳴らし、歩道で人々がおしゃべりし、内部で繰り広げられているドラマには気づかない。彼らの上の階にある小さなアパート、ユングクは骨まで冷たい空虚感が染み込んでいくのを感じた。足元の地面がもはや硬くないことに気づいた。友情、信頼、そして、現実そのものが今や分裂していた。彼は急に振り返り自分と対面した。床にへたり込み、膝を胸に抱え、ぼんやりと壁を見つめていた。部屋の緊張は、今にも破裂しそうな嵐雲のように高まった。ユングクの胸が再び締め付けられた。怒り、混乱、そして裏切りの渦が彼を窒息させそうだった。声は震えた。彼は冷静に話そうとしたにもかかわらず。理解できないの？私には理解できない。君を信頼していたのに。体操、まるで一撃一撃のように、その言葉にたじろいだ。こんな風に見られたくなかったと彼は囁いた。ユングクの荒い呼吸の音にかき消されて、かろうじて聞こえる。見た目とは違う。説明が必要だと感じた。言葉に詰まると、部屋を飲み込むようなぎこちない沈黙が残った。ユングクは髪をかき上げ、引っ張った。苛立ちで髪の毛を引っ張り上げた。じゃあ、全部話してくれよ。彼の声は鋭かったが、内心は震えていた。抑えきれない感情の嵐をあらわにする弱さが潜んでいた。彼は常に自分の感情を冷静に保てることを誇りにしていた。作文しかし、これは混沌の化身であり、一つの衝撃的な啓示によって世界がひっくり返された。体操、飲み込んだ声は、充満した空間の中で湿っぽくぎこちなく響いた。ゆっくりと、ためらいがちに彼は話し始めた。言葉の一つ一つが重みを帯びていた。罪悪感と恐怖に押しつぶされそうになった。ユングクは、最初は無害に見えた小さな秘密の行動を疑うことさえなかったが、今では、それらは、より暗いタペストリーの断片として現れた。ジムンが話せば話すほど、ユングクは彼の支配力を感じた。現実のズレ、善悪、忠誠、裏切りの境界線が方向感覚を失わせるほど曖昧に歪む。エース、ジムの告白が解け、ユングクの心は激しく揺れ動き、 記憶が細部まで蘇り、苦痛に満ちた。共に笑うたびに、彼はあらゆる沈黙の視線、あらゆる接触に気づくべきだった微妙な兆候の隠された意味を探したが、何も見つからない。まるで過去が一夜にして書き換えられ、鋭くギザギザした現在だけが残ったかのようだった。四方八方から押し寄せてくる。部屋は彼らの声を除いて静まり返っていたが、言葉にされない疑問が空気を揺らしていた。ユングクの手は震えながら机の端に手を伸ばし、爪が木に食い込む。アパートの鼓動が一定に、そして、まるで壁が彼のパニックを映し出しているかのようだった。こめかみの脇に一筋の汗が浮かび、彼は手のひらを押さえて、額に手を当て、思考の嵐の中で何か拠り所を見つけようとしていた。ジムの目は大きく見開かれ、恐怖と羞恥が入り混じった表情で彼は嘆願した。ここまでするつもりはなかったと彼は認めた。広大で緊張感に満ちた空間に響く言葉は虚しく、しかし生々しい真実の重みを背負っていることを自覚していた。それでも、傷は負わされたのだ。その暴露は彼らの間の目に見えない絆を破壊し、疑惑と疑念と、裏切りの苦い味。ユングクはついに低い声で口を開いた。ささやく、自分が何をしたのか分かっているのか？これで全てがどれだけ変わる？彼はアドレナリンを感じた。それは鋭く、執拗に彼の中に脈打っており、あらゆる動きを緊張させ、あらゆる視線を計算していた。一瞬ジムの顔には、告白したことで重荷が下りたかのように安堵の表情が浮かんだ。しかし、ユングクの視線は、固く、揺るぎない。安堵はまだ値しない。この後では、時間が経つにつれ、奇妙なもやがかかったように過ぎ去った。言葉は交わされ、そして後悔した。謝罪はあったが、どれも十分ではなかった。ユングクの心は思考の渦に巻き込まれ、相反する感情が煙のように絡み合っていた。彼は自分だけでなく自分自身にも疑問を抱いていた。警告の兆候を無視した。彼は信じすぎ、世間知らずだったのだろうか。内政の重圧が重力のように重くのしかかり、動きはゆっくりと、慎重に、それでいて橋はギクシャクとしていた。外の世界は、未知のリズムを刻み続けていた。無数の見知らぬ人々が、休むことなく動き続ける日常。このアパートでのユングクの孤独は、はっきりと見て取れた。壁が迫り、床板は彼の落ち着きのなさのせいできしみ、あらゆる音が増幅された。遠くの交通のざわめき、窓の外の鳥の鳴き声、ジムの体重が床にわずかに移動する音。小さな音一つ一つが、現実が崩壊し、何もかもが消え去ったことを思い起こさせる。午後半ばには、最初のショックは冷たく、くすぶる感情へと変わり始めた。緊張したユングクはソファの端に座り、床を見つめ、指をしっかりと絡ませて、崩れかけた心のかけらを物理的につなぎ合わせた。ジムンは地面に横たわり、静かになった。硬直した表情で、呼吸一つ一つに罪悪感がにじみ出ていた。ユングクの思考は怒りと不安の間で揺れ動いていた。見捨てられたという思いと、手を差し伸べ、修復し、理解したいという衝動の間で揺れ動いていた。ジムがいつも、彼は練習中に微笑んでいた。それは、それまでは無邪気だった小さな気遣いだった。今やその気遣いは、疑いに染まり、意味は曖昧で、その意図は彼がつい先ほど発見した秘密によって不明瞭になっていた。不協和音は狂乱した。彼は叫びたかった、ジムを揺さぶり、正直にさせたい、明晰さを求めたいと思った。しかし同時に、耐え難い真実の親密さから逃れるために、退却する。時間は夕方へと溶けていった。部屋は薄暗くなり、影が、光の中で伸びたり曲げたりしていた。ユングクはようやく立ち上がり、ゆっくりとしたリズムで走りながら荷物をまとめた。彼は頭の中でシナリオを書き、何が起こったのか、なぜ起こったのか、そしてそれが彼らの将来に何を意味するのかを理解しようとした。再び窓辺に立ち止まり、 眼下の街を見つめ、都会生活の無関心な混沌の中に明晰さを求めていた。すべてを知るために、彼はようやく声を落ち着かせたが、疲れは感じていた。もう半分しか真実を語らないし、秘密、もしこれを解決するつもりなら、もし解決する方法があるなら、全部話してほしい。ジムは眉を潜め、顔をしかめた。薄暗い光に照らされ、かつては気楽そうだった顔に深い後悔の痕跡が刻まれていた。教えてあげる、君のすべてだと彼はつぶやいた。かすかな声で、でも約束してくれ。ここに残ると約束してくれ。ユングクの心は締め付けられた。恐怖と絶望が入り混じり、まるで万力のように彼を締め付けた。叫びたかった。崩壊寸前だった。しかし彼は根を下ろし、どんなに悲惨な真実であっても、自ら立ち向かおうと決意した。もしかしたら彼は一度鋭く切りつけた。私はここに残るが、君は正直でなければならない。完全に正直でなければならない。嘘は許さない。そして、その、もろく緊張した瞬間、生産の最初の糸が解け始めた。それはその後も日々紡がれていく糸だった。衝撃的な行為だけでなく、二人を特徴づける欲望、恐怖、執着、そして忠誠心といった隠された層を暴き出せ。これからの道は、対決、悲痛、そして啓示が約束されていた。しかし、ユングクは心の底で自分が。振り返ると世界は一変した。何もかもが変わってしまった。部屋は再び静まり返ったが、今度は、静寂は別の重みを帯びていた。それは、これから起こる啓示の嵐の前の脆い静けさ、暫定的な期待だった。アヘッド、ユンカック&ジェイ・サットイン・ミューチュアル・エクサウスション&テンション。シャドウズ・ストレッチング・ロング・アクロス・ザ・ルーム、アウェア。That what they had discovered was not an end point, but the beginning of a journey that would challenge every bond, every truth, and every secret they had ever shared. The room GREW called as evening deepened, shadows scanning into corners where light dared not reach. Yungak sat back against the sofa, his eyes fixed on a crack in the wall that suddenly seemed monumental, as if it symbolized the fissure in his trust. The air smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and something else, something intangible that made his skin prickle. He could feel every heartbeat, every tremor of his own pulse, as though the room had become a living, breathing entity, aware of the turmoil within it. JIMN remained on the floor, knees drawn to his chest, but the rigidity in his posture had begun to soften the weight of shame visible in every line of his body. He stole glance at Yungak, each one tentative, as though seeking permission to speak, to confess further to bridge the chasm of betrayal that had opened between them. His lips parted, hesitated, then finally moved. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he murmured. I didn't mean for it to for you to find out this way. Yukkuk's eyes narrowed, frustration clawing at him. Not supposed to happen. You were reckless. You didn't just cross a line. You erased it. How am I supposed to process that? His voice trembled, though he fought to keep it steady. The ange shimmered beneath the surface, but a deeper, more dangerous emotion stirred alongside it. Fear, fear not for himself, but for the fragility of everything they had shared. The precarious balance of their friendship and trust. Jim's gaze dropped to the floor, the pale light of the fatting sun glinting off the wet sheen of tears straining in his eyes. One I thought I could handle it. I thought I was careful, he admitted, ボイスベアリーオーディブル。But sometimes sings.
Spiral. Faster than you can control. I didn't want you to see me like this. I didn't want to lose you. The words struck Youngik in a way he hadn't anticipated. The sharpness of anger dulled slightly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating weight of sorrow and confusion. He closed his eyes, pressed a hand to his forehead, and let out a breath that he hadn't realized he was holding. His mind spun, replaying every detail, every subtle gesture, every moment that now felt like it carried hidden meaning. Trust, he realized, wasn't something fragile. It was something combustible, and Jim had ignited it with a single devastating spark. Youngguk's gaze returned to Jim, and for a fleeting moment, he saw not the betrayal, not the guilt, but the boy he had known for years. The boy who had laughed beside him, who had shared secrets and whispers, who had trusted him in ways no one else had. And then the image shattered, replaced by the reality of what he had just witnessed. The dichotomy was unbearable, a twisting knife of conflicting emotions that left him physically aching. He stood abruptly, packing the room again, fingers tapping against his arms in restless agitation. "You have to understand," he said, voice low but insistent. "What you did, it's not just a mistake, it's a fracture. And fractures, they spread if you don't fix them." Jim's lips trembled and he raised his hands as if to stop Youngik to offer reassurance. But the movement only highlighted his vulnerability. "I want to fix it," he said quietly. I need you to believe that I never meant to hurt you. Not like this." The room fell silent, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Outside, the city's hum continued, indifferent, a stark contrast to the intensity within the apartment. Youngik sank into the sofa again, running a hand across his face, trying to calm the storm of thoughts raging in his mind. Each memory he recalled now seemed double-edged. Every laugh shadowed by suspicion, every touch tinged with uncertainty. And yet, beneath the chaos, a strange clarity began to emerge. Youngik realized that understanding wouldn't come from anger alone, nor from avoidance. It would come from confrontation, from patience, from unraveling the layers that had led to this moment. He looked at Jim, sitting there with eyes cast downward, the weight of guilt pressing upon him like a tangible force, and knew that the path forward would not be simple. Hours passed with a slow, grinding rhythm. Words were exchanged in fits and starts, sentences trailing into silence. Confessions interrupted by hesitation, realizations by denial. The room became a confessional of sorts. Each object, the sofa, the scattered papers, the dimming light, bearing witness to the slow dismantling and tentative rebuilding of trust. Youngik began to understand that Jim's actions were not born solely of malice, but a fear of obsession of impulses that had grown unchecked. And still, comprehension offered little solace for the pain. Night fell fully, casting the apartment into a deep, inky darkness. Youngik moved to the window once more, staring at the twinkling city below, the ordinary life of strangers starkly juxtaposed against the storm inside him. He felt the weight of solitude press against him, a loneliness that was both terrifying and grounding. The city lights reflected in his eyes like distant stars, unfailing yet beautiful. And for a moment he allowed himself to breathe without judgment, without fury, just observing. "You know," Jim said after a long pause, voice tentative, almost fragile, "I've always feared that if you ever saw this side of me, you wouldn't stay." Youngguk's eyes met his sharp and penetrating yet tempered with a profound weariness. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive this," he admitted, voice low and steady. "But leaving isn't the answer either. Understanding may be confrontation, patience, and honesty." Jim nodded slowly, a quiet tremor in his shoulders as he absorbed the weight of the words. The room settled into a tense calm, two friends, bound by shared history, fractured trust, and the uncertain hope of reconciliation. Outside, the night deepened, stars blinking faintly, indifferent, yet constant, a reminder that life moved on, even when hearts were on the edge of collapse. As the first hints of dawn approached, casting pale light across the room, Youngik realized that the journey ahead would be arduous, painful, filled with revelations, confrontations, and the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding what had been broken. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the fear of further betrayal, he understood something essential. Bonds forged through years of shared experience could endure more than he had ever imagined. Jim remained on the floor, quiet now, accepting the silent acknowledgement. That despite everything, there was a chance, a small, fragile chance to begin again. Youngik looked at him, and for the first time since the discovery, he felt a flicker of something that resembled hope. Not naive hope, but the hard-earned understanding that even in darkness, the light could return. The room, once heavy with tension and unspoken terror, now held a different kind of silence, tentative, watchful, alive with possibility. The storm had not passed, not entirely. But the first cracks of dawn brought clarity, a chance to face the consequences, to confront the secrets, and to navigate the treacherous waters of trust, betrayal, and human complexity. And in that fragile, suspended moment between night and day, Youngik knew one thing with certainty. Nothing would ever be the same again. And yet, perhaps for the first time, that was not entirely a bad thing. The next morning, the pale sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin, fragile stripes, painting the apartment in a muted gold. Youngik sat at the edge of the sofa, elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced tightly together as if holding himself together from the inside out. The previous night's storm still clung to him like a second skin. The images, the confession, the raw vulnerability in Jim's eyes. They lingered, pressing against his mind with a quiet insistence. Jim remained on the floor, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, his posture tense yet fragile. He hadn't spoken much since their long conversation, only shifting slightly when Younguk's gaze lingered too long. The air between them was thick, a mixture of lingering anger, sorrow, fear, and a strange hesitant hope. Younguk's thoughts moved like shards of glass, sharp, scattered, impossible to reconcile. He wanted answers, yet he feared them. He wanted to trust, yet he couldn't ignore the tremor of doubt that coursed through his chest with every heartbeat. The apartment felt different. In the daylight, shadows softened, yet the tension remained coiled and waiting. Youngik ran a hand through his hair and exhaled slowly. "We need to talk about everything," he said finally, voice low, carrying the weight of exhaustion. "I need details. Every detail. No omissions, no excuses." Jim swallowed hard, his throat tight, eyes flicking nervously to the floor before finally meeting Younguk's gaze. I'll tell you," he murmured. "It's not easy to explain. I didn't even understand it myself at first. But I'll tell you everything, I promise." The sunlight caught the faint tremor of his hands, the slight quiver in his shoulders, and Younguk's chest tightened. He realized how fragile Jim had become under the weight of his own secret, how desperately he had been trying to navigate something he could not control. Younguk's anger wavered, replaced by an uneasy mixture of empathy and frustration. "I need to know why," Younguk said, voice quieter now, less explosive, but no less intense. "I need to understand how it got to this point. Why you did what you did. Not just the act, but the obsession, the secrecy, the risk." Jim closed his eyes, exhaling shakily as though summoning courage from some hidden reserve. "It started small," he began. "Little things I thought I could manage, things that seemed harmless, but they grew, and I couldn't stop them. I didn't want anyone to know because I was ashamed, afraid. And I thought I could keep it contained." His voice wavered, a fragile thread stretched to breaking. "But then it escalated faster than I could control. And when you walked in, I realized how far I had gone." Youngik felt the words like stones dropping in his chest. He had always believed that people could be understood if you paid enough attention, if you listened closely, if you trusted your instincts. But this was beyond instinct, beyond comprehension. It was a maze of impulse, fear, and vulnerability twisting in ways he had never imagined. He paced again, slow, deliberate steps, each one echoing in the quiet apartment. "You have to understand," he said finally, voice taut with a strange intensity, "that what you've done. It's not just a mistake, it's a rupture. And ruptures, they spread if they're ignored." Jim flinched at the word, the sound of it vibrating like a bell through the silence. "I know," he whispered. "And I'm trying to make it right. I want to make it right. Please, just let me explain fully." Youngik stopped packing and leaned against the wall, arms crossed, jaw tight. He watched Jim, seeing the fear, the shame, the desperation, the raw humanity of him, and in that moment, he understood something crucial. What had happened was beyond judgment, beyond simple anger. It was about survival, of trust, of identity, of the fragile thread that connected them. Hours passed. As Jim spoke, his voice unraveling the story in hesitant fragments, then in fuller sentences, then in a flood of words. Youngik listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes holding back the surge of anger or disbelief. Sometimes closing his eyes and letting the room spin around him as he processed each revelation. The narrative was complex, layered with psychological nuance, obsession, and moments of pure vulnerability that left Youngik feeling raw and exposed. The apartment grew, warmer as the sun climbed, lights spilling over the scattered objects on the floor, the tipped chair, the remnants of last night's tension. The mundane world outside continued, indifferent, yet inside, time seemed suspended, each second heavy with consequence. Youngik felt the weight of every moment. The gravity of understanding someone in their darkest truth, the fragile hope of reconciling with what had been broken. By afternoon, the initial wave of shock had subsided into a tense calm. The room held a different energy now, less frantic, more measured, still uneasy, but with the faintest glimmer of possibility. Youngik sat on the sofa again, staring at the floor, processing. Jim remained seated on the ground, attentive yet wary, ready to answer any question, ready to expose every layer that Youngik demanded. "You know," Jim said quietly after a long pause, "I've always feared if you saw this side of me. If anyone saw this side of me, you wouldn't stay, and I couldn't bear to lose you. Not after everything." Youngyuk's jaw tightened. He felt the ache of conflicting emotions. Hurt, betrayal, sympathy, exhaustion, and a tentative, cautious hope. He realized that despite the devastation, despite the rupture, there was still a thread connecting them, fragile perhaps, but present. And threads, when treated carefully, could be mended. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive this," he said finally, voice low. "But leaving isn't an option, not yet. We need to face this. All of it together, honestly, or nothing will survive." Jim nodded, a slight tremor passing through him. "I'll do whatever it takes," he whispered. "I'll face everything if you stay with me." The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet carried a different weight, an unspoken understanding, fragile and tentative, but real. Youngik felt it in the subtle relaxation of Jim's posture. In the careful way, he looked up, meeting his gaze in the unspoken promise that they would navigate the aftermath together. The sunlight shifted, casting long stripes across the apartment, painting it in a mix of gold and shadow. Youngik felt the strange duality of the day. Light illuminating the remnants of darkness. Shadows marking the places where trust had fractured but not disappeared entirely. He exhaled slowly, feeling the tension ease slightly from his shoulders, though the storm within had not fully passed. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm, oblivious to the quiet reckoning happening above its streets. Youngik looked at Jim and realized that life like the city below would go on, indifferent and unyielding. But here in this apartment, there was a chance, a fragile, precious chance to confront the truth, to rebuild, and perhaps to understand one another in ways that had never been possible before. As evening approached, the light softened, shadows stretching longer, mingling with the golden glow. Youngik moved to the window, feeling the subtle warmth of the sun on his skin, the pulse of life outside echoing in his ears. He felt the weight of everything, the betrayal, the fear, the rawness of Jim's confession, but also the faintest thread of hope, fragile yet undeniable. In the stillness of the apartment, with the world outside continuing its indifferent dance, Youngik and Jim sat together, two figures bound by history, secrets, and the uncertain possibility of understanding. Nothing had been fully resolved. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with tension, emotion, and the lingering shadows of what had been revealed. But for the first time since that night of discovery, there was a quiet, shared acknowledgement. They would face it together, step by step, truth by truth. And perhaps in time the fractured pieces of trust could be pieced back into something stronger, something real. The night crept slowly over the city, draping the apartment in a velvet darkness that pressed against the windows, muffling the sounds of the streets below. Youngik sat cross-legged on the floor, his back resting against the sofa, fingers tracing the grain of the wooden floorboards as he tried to focus his thoughts. His mind was a storm of images, memories, and emotions tangled so tightly that each one threatened to tear open another layer of confusion. Jim remained on the couch, a thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders, the faint glow of the city lights catching the moisture of unshed tears in his eyes. Youngyuk's voice broke the silence, quiet yet insistent. "We need to talk about boundaries, about what's acceptable and what is. You cross them, but I need to understand why." Jim's lips pressed together, eyes fixed on some distant point, as though looking beyond the walls of the apartment into a place where answers might exist. It's complicated, he admitted, voice low, almost swallowed by the darkness. I didn't plan for this to grow into what it did. It was a spiral. I thought I was careful. I thought I could contain it. I was wrong. Youngik closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, the air feeling heavy as it left his lungs. Every corner of the room seemed to hum with tension, every object a silent witness to their fractured reality. He remembered the moment he had discovered Jim, the shock, the disbelief, the surge of adrenaline that had made his world tilt. He had felt anger, betrayal, confusion, and yet beneath it all, an unshakable thread of concern for Jim, for the fragile bond they shared, for the unraveling of what they had built over years. You weren't just reckless, Youngik said, his voice low, measured, but sharp enough to cut through the stillness. You were hiding. You let it grow in secret. And that's the part I can't ignore. Jim's shoulders slumped slightly, a gesture of surrender, of acknowledgement. I know, he said quietly. I should have told you. I should have stopped it before it got this far. I didn't want to face the consequences. I was afraid, and I thought I could manage it on my own. I thought I could survive it. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city and the distant muffled sounds of traffic. Youngik ran his hands through his hair, tugging at the strands in frustration. The tension coiling inside him like a tightly wound spring. Survival isn't just about you, he said. It's about everyone around you, too. We all have a stake. We all feel the ripples of your actions. Jim's gaze lifted slowly, meeting Youngyuk's eyes. For a moment, it was as though the weight of their entire history, the years of friendship, trust, and shared moments hung in that single look. His lips quivered, but he spoke with quiet resolve. I want to make it right. I don't know if I can undo what's been done, but I will try. I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. Not like this. Youngyuk's chest ached with the intensity of his conflicting emotions. Anger, fear, compassion, betrayal. They all swirled together in a chaotic storm. He wanted to scream, to demand more, to shake the truth out of Jim's lips. And yet, he knew that wouldn't lead anywhere. What was needed was patience, clarity, and confrontation. Layer by layer, truth by truth. Then you need to tell me everything, Youngik said finally, voice taut but calm, carrying the weight of authority tempered by exhaustion. No omissions, no hiding. I need to understand the entire spiral, the entire chain that brought us here. Only then can we even begin to think about repair. Jim nodded slowly, the blanket falling slightly from his shoulders as he leaned forward, hands resting on his knees. I'll tell you, he said, voice shaking slightly. It started innocently. Enough, just thoughts, urges I didn't fully understand. I tried to suppress them, to redirect them, but they grew. And the more I tried to control them, the more they controlled me. By the time he found me, I was already deep into it, deeper than I wanted to admit, even to myself. Youngik absorbed the words, letting them settle, letting the heavy oppressive tension of the room press in around him. Each confession added weight, each revelation another layer of complexity to the situation he now had to navigate. The apartment felt simultaneously intimate and suffocating. Every shadow a reminder of what had been hidden, every beam of light a hint at possible redemption. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Youngik asked, his voice low but firm, carrying the subtle undercurrent of hurt that had been building since that night. We faced everything together before. Why not this? Jim's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Fear, he admitted, simply. Fear that you'd see me differently, that you'd leave. I couldn't face the possibility of losing you, not after everything. I thought I could bear it alone. I thought I could hide it. I was wrong. The confession hung in the room like a heavy fog. The words echoing off the walls, mixing with the faint scent of coffee and the lingering tension of the previous night. Youngyuk's mind raced, not just with anger and betrayal, but with the knowing need to comprehend, to piece together the puzzle of Jim's actions, to understand the fragile human impulses that had led them here. I don't know if I can forgive this easily, Youngik said after a long pause, voice low, almost a whisper. But leaving isn't the answer either. We need to face it, all of it together, honestly, or nothing. We'll survive. Jim nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, his gaze fixed on Youngik with a mixture of fear, hope, and vulnerability. I'll do whatever it takes, he whispered. I'll face everything if you stay. The night deepened, wrapping the apartment in a quiet, almost sacred stillness. Youngik felt the weight of everything, the betrayal, the fear, the raw vulnerability of Jim's confession, but also the faintest thread of hope. Delicate yet undeniable, the path forward was uncertain, fraught with tension, revelation, and the painstaking process of rebuilding trust. But it existed, fragile and tentative like a fragile flame flickering in the darkness. Outside the city continued its indifferent rhythm, oblivious to the quiet reckoning above its streets. Inside, two friends sat together, bound by history, secrets, and the uncertain possibility of understanding. They had crossed the threshold of chaos, and though nothing was resolved, the first step had been taken. A step into the murky, unpredictable terrain of human truth, confession, and the fragile hope of reconciliation. The first streaks of dawn crept across the city skyline, painting the apartment in muted shades of amber and gray. Youngik still sat on the floor, hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the faint patterns of light dancing on the wooden floorboards. Outside, life continued in oblivious rhythms. Cars hum, footsteps echo, the distant clatter of construction. But inside, time felt suspended, stretched taut between the weight of revelation and the fragile thread of understanding that remained between them. Jim, still seated on the couch, rubbed his palms over his face as though trying to erase the shame etched into his expression. Every subtle twitch of his fingers, every slight tremor in his shoulders, spoke volumes of the guilt and fear that had governed his actions. Youngik watched, silently, studying the man before him, aware that the quiet stillness was not peace, but a tense calm that could shatter at the slightest misstep. "I need to know everything," Youngik said finally, voice steady, despite the storm of emotions underneath. "Every step, every thought that led you here. No omissions, no excuses. I need to understand the chain that brought us to this moment." Jim lifted his head, eyes red-rimmed but resolute, and nodded. "I'll tell you," he whispered. His voice carried the fragile weight of confession, layered with vulnerability and the subtle tremor of desperation. "It started with curiosity, something small that I thought I could control. But curiosity grew into habit. Habit grew into obsession, and before I realized it, I was already entangled in something I couldn't contain. I lied to myself, told myself I was careful that it wouldn't affect anyone, that I could survive it alone. But I was wrong, and, when you walked in, I saw all the damage I had done." Youngik listened, each word sinking into him like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples through every thought, every memory, every carefully constructed notion of who he thought Jim was. The room itself seemed to respond, the air thickening, pressing against him with the intensity of the revelation. He could feel the tremor of his own pulse in his temples, the subtle tightening of his chest, the sharp edge of adrenaline sharpening his senses. "And you didn't think I deserved to know?" Youngik asked, voice taut with barely controlled anger. "You didn't think I deserved the truth?" Jim's gaze dropped to his hands, which rested limply on his knees. "I was afraid," he said quietly. "Afraid you'd see me differently. Afraid you'd leave. Afraid that the bond we built over years could be destroyed by my own weakness. I thought I could manage it. I thought I could contain it, but I couldn't." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, yet oddly grounding. Youngik felt the complexity of Jim's confession pressing against him, demanding understanding, even as it provoked anger, disbelief, and sorrow. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly, feeling the weight of countless emotions pressing down like an invisible hand. "You have to understand," Youngik said. Finally, voice quieter now, carrying the weight of restraint. "This isn't just about your actions. It's about trust, about the foundation of everything between us. And trust, once fractured, it doesn't heal easily. It requires patience, confrontation, and understanding. Can you give me that?" Jim nodded slowly, a single deliberate movement as if anchoring himself to the fragile hope in Youngik's words. "I'll give you everything," he whispered. "Every confession, every truth, every moment I tried to hide. I'll face it all if you stay with me." The apartment was silent, for a long moment, filled only with the soft hum of morning traffic and the faint creak of floorboards beneath the weight of unspoken tension. Youngik sank to the sofa, pressing a palm against his forehead, trying to absorb the enormity of what he had learned to process the complex weave of secrecy, obsession, and fear that had led them to this moment. "You know," Youngik said after a long pause, voice low, contemplative, "I can't promise forgiveness. Not yet, but, leaving isn't an option. If we walk away now, everything we've built, everything we've shared crumbles, and I can't let that happen. Not yet. Jim's eyes glistened with unshed tears, a tremor of hope breaking through the layers of shame and fear. Then we face it, he whispered together, step by step, truth by truth. And in that fragile, suspended moment, Youngik felt a shift. Not resolution, not peace, but the faintest glimmer of possibility. The path ahead would be long, painful, and filled with uncertainty. Yet, it existed, tangible, and real like a narrow bridge spanning a chasm. They would navigate the treacherous waters of human frailty, secrets, and trust, not with certainty, but with determination. The sun climbed higher, casting long stripes of light across the apartment floor, illuminating the scattered objects, the tipped chair, the traces of spilled coffee, a room transformed from a stage of chaos into a space of tentative reconciliation. Yuck and Jim sat together, two figures bound by history, betrayal, and the uncertain promise of understanding. They had crossed the threshold into a new reality, one where secrets were laid bare, emotions raw, and every action carried weight. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious, relentless, indifferent. Inside, the apartment breathed with their shared tension, their fragile hope, and the unspoken acknowledgement that life would continue, but only because they chose to face it together. Youngik exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain slightly from his shoulders. The storm had not passed. The fractures were still there, but the first tentative steps toward repair had begun. He looked at Jim, studying the mixture of fear, regret, and resolve in his expression, and felt a subtle but undeniable certainty. Nothing would ever be the same again, but perhaps in time, the pieces could be rearranged into something stronger, something real. And, as the morning light spilled fully into the room, Youngik realized that for the first time since the discovery, he could breathe. Not fully free of the past, not without fear, but grounded, ready to face the difficult journey ahead, aware that the fragile bond between them, though tested, had not been completely severed. The afternoon sun had climbed higher, bathing the apartment in a warm, almost blinding light. Yet the warmth did little to ease the tension that lingered in the air. Youngik remained seated on the sofa, his gaze distant, tracing the outlines of the furniture as though each item held secrets of its own. His mind replayed the previous night in painstaking detail, the shock, the betrayal, the trembling fear in Jim's eyes, and the subsequent confessions that had slowly unraveled the threads of everything he thought he knew. Jim sat across from him, knees drawn up, hands clasped tightly around them, eyes flicking nervously to Youngik before retreating again to the floor. Every movement he made was deliberate, cautious, as if the slightest misstep could shatter the fragile calm they had achieved. The apartment was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the city beyond the window. A stark reminder that the world continued obliviously, while their lives teetered on the edge of upheaval. You need to understand, Youngik said. Finally, his voice low, but carrying a gravity that silenced even the faintest rustle of fabric. This isn't just about what you did, it's about why you did it, what drove you to this point, and how far it could go if left unchecked. I need to see the layers beneath it all. Jim's gaze lifted, his eyes reflecting the faint sunlight, brimming with unspoken regret. I was lost, he admitted, voice trembling slightly. I thought I could manage the urges, the thoughts, the compulsions that kept building inside me. I thought I could hide them, control them, compartmentalize them. But every time I tried, they grew stronger, and the fear of being exposed, of losing everything, especially you, it paralyzed me. I didn't know how to stop it, and I didn't know how to ask for help. Youngik absorbed the words, feeling the weight of them pressing into his chest. The raw honesty, the vulnerability, the admission of powerlessness. It was almost unbearable yet impossible to ignore. He had always believed in strength, in self-control, in the ability to face one's own demons without collapsing. But here was Jim, barring the fractured pieces of his psyche in a way that left no room for pretenses. You didn't just hide it, Youngik said, voice low, measured, but carrying an unmistakable edge of hurt. You let it fester, you let it grow. You kept it from me, even as it spiraled. Do you understand what that does to someone who trusted you completely? Jim flinched, a subtle twitch of his shoulders, and swallowed hard. I know, he whispered. I realize now how selfish I was, how reckless I wasn't thinking about you, about us. I was thinking only about surviving my own spiral, about containing the chaos within me, about avoiding judgment and rejection. And in doing so, I nearly destroyed the only thing that mattered most to me, you. The room seemed to contract around them, the air thick with the weight of confessions, the gravity of guilt, and the tension of emotions raw and unfiltered. Young-Yuk's chest tight, the adrenaline from the shock of discovery mingling with the simmering anger and the subtle undercurrent of compassion he felt for the person he had known for years. He could see the fragility of Jim's state, the way his hands shook slightly, the quiver in his lips, the subtle tension in his shoulders. It was all painfully real, all unbearably human. Do you understand what trust means? Young-Ik asked quietly, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, fingers clasped together. It's not just about loyalty or honesty. It's about knowing someone with your whole being and believing that no matter the flaws, no matter the darkness, they will not betray the foundation of what you share. You violated that. And now we have to see if it can even be repaired. Jim lowered his gaze, nodding slowly, a shiver of acceptance passing through him. I'll do whatever it takes, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I'll face every consequence, every doubt, every fear, if it means I can start to make amends. If it means I can earn back your trust. I know it will take time. I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to try. Young-Yuk's hands loosened their grip on each other as he leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, trying to process the intensity of the moment. The apartment, once a place of comfort and routine, had become a crucible in which their bond was tested, stretched, and reshaped. Every shadow seemed sharper now. Every ray of sunlight a reminder of the fragile balance between revelation and reconciliation. You have to understand, Young-Ik continued, voice softer now, almost reflective, that this isn't something that will be fixed with words alone. Actions, honesty, openness. They're the only way forward. Every step we take from here has to be deliberate, conscious, and real. No hiding, no half-truths, no avoidance. Jim nodded. Again, a subtle determination etching itself into his features. I understand, he said. And I'm ready. I need to be ready. I can't keep living in the shadows of my own mistakes. I need to face them. And I need to face you with everything laid bare. The hours stretched on, their conversation meandering through confessions, explanations, and reflections, each sentence peeling back another layer of fear, guilt, and humanity. The apartment, once a backdrop to ordinary life, had transformed into a stage where every emotion was amplified, every word significant, every gesture a delicate negotiation of trust and understanding. By the time the evening sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in dusky shades of orange and violet, Young-Ik and Jim had settled into a quiet rhythm. Not peace, not reconciliation, but a fragile equilibrium, a tentative acknowledgement that the path ahead would be long, difficult, and filled with uncertainty, but that they would face it together. Young-Ik gazed out the window, the fatting light reflecting in his eyes, and felt the weight of everything, the betrayal, the fear, the confession, the delicate thread of hope that remained. The city outside moved on, relentless and indifferent. Yet inside the apartment, two friends sat, bound by history, mistakes, and the fragile possibility of understanding, ready to navigate the treacherous terrain of human complexity, emotion, and trust. Night fell like a heavy curtain over the city, cloaking the streets below in inky darkness and muting the distant hum of traffic into a low, almost inaudible thrum. The apartment, now dimly lit by the soft glow of a single lamp, seemed suspended in time. Shadows stretched across the walls, bending in ways that made the familiar furniture feel alien, almost menacing. Young-Ik sat cross-legged on the floor near the window, his eyes reflecting the faint light as he stared outward, yet seeing nothing of the city beyond. His mind was consumed by the intricate, jagged patterns of betrayal, guilt, and the fragile glimmers of hope that had begun to emerge after the morning's confessions. Jim sat across from him, legs folded beneath him, shoulders hunched, hands gripping the edge of the couch. Every subtle movement was tense, every breath careful, measured. The weight of his own shame seemed to press him down into the fabric of the couch. And yet, there was a quiet determination in his eyes, a willingness to endure the storm he had wrought, to face the consequences of his actions and to attempt the impossible, earning back Young-Yuk's trust. You need to understand something, Young-Ik said finally, voice breaking the thick silence, low and deliberate. This isn't just about what happened. It's about the ripple effect. Every secret, every omission, every small choice you made, it doesn't exist in isolation. It spreads, touches, everything. And now we're standing in the middle of that ripple, trying to figure out if we can survive it. Jim swallowed hard, a subtle shiver passing through him. I know, he whispered, eyes fixed on the floor. I didn't see it at first. I thought I could handle it. Thought I could control it. But everything got out of hand. And then you found me, and I realized the weight of what I had done. I realized how much I had endangered. Not just myself, but us. Our friendship, everything we've built. Younguk's chest tightened at the confession. The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with the tension of raw, unfiltered emotion. He ran a hand through his hair, tugging slightly as if trying to physically unravel the knot of thoughts inside his head. Every memory of Jim, every shared laugh, every glance, every silent moment they had ever shared now felt distorted, layered with the newly revealed truth. The lines between trust, betrayal, love, and fear blurred into a dizzying mosaic. Do you even understand what it feels like to see someone you trust, someone you thought you knew completely, engage in something so secretive, so consuming, and so dangerous? Younguk's voice shook slightly, though he fought to keep it steady. It's not just betrayal, it's a fundamental shift. I can't unsee it. I can't unknow it. And yet, I'm here listening, trying to understand. Do you understand the gravity of that? Jim's lips trembled, his eyes glistening under the soft lamplight. I do, he said softly. I understand more than I can express. And that's why I'm here confessing everything, exposing myself completely. Because if I can't face the consequences of my actions, then I don't deserve anything. Not your forgiveness, not your presence, not the chance to rebuild what I broke. Youngik exhaled slowly, leaning back against the wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment. The weight of his own emotions, anger, betrayal, fear, and a grudging empathy, pressed against him like an invisible vice. He realized that Jim's confession, though painful, was also an act of courage. The raw vulnerability, the willingness to endure judgment, and the possibility of rejection, revealed a side of Jim he had never fully understood, even in years of close friendship. The thing is, Youngik said finally, voice quieter now, reflective, this isn't something that will resolve overnight. You've created cracks, fractures that won't just disappear. And even if you're honest from this point forward, even if you lay everything bare, the scars will remain. We'll have to navigate them carefully, deliberately every day if we want to survive this. Jim nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Youngik with a mixture of fear, remorse, and determination. I understand, he whispered. I'll endure, whatever it takes. I'll face every doubt, every anger, every moment of mistrust. If it means I can earn back even a fraction of what I lost, I'll do it no matter how long it takes. The apartment settled into a tentative quiet. After that, outside, the city pulsed with life, lights flickering in buildings, the distant hum of engines, and murmurs of voices rising and falling like a tide. Inside, the weight of unspoken emotions hung heavily between them, a delicate tension that could collapse at any misstep, yet also held the faintest glimmer of fragile hope. Younguk's gaze returned to the window, tracing the movements of shadows cast by the street lights below. Each passing figure, each flickering neon sign seemed to underscore the normality of the world outside, juxtaposed painfully against the chaos and intensity of what was unfolding in the apartment. It was as if time itself had fractured, the ordinary continuing unabated while their personal reality was suspended in a fragile limbo. You know, Youngik said after a long pause, voice soft, almost contemplative. There's a part of me that wants to retreat to shut the door on this entirely and pretend none of it happened. But there's another part, a part that refuses to let us walk away without trying. Because despite everything, despite the fractures, despite the betrayal, I still care. I still want to understand. I still want to see if we can fix this. Jim's shoulders shifted slightly, a subtle, almost imperceptible relaxation, though the weight of guilt and fear remained. Then we take it step by step, he said quietly. Every truth, every confrontation, every moment we face together. No lies, no hiding, no shortcuts. If we do this, maybe we can rebuild something real. Maybe it won't be the same, but maybe it can be stronger. The lamp's light flickered softly, casting shadows that danced along the walls, bending and stretching like echoes of the tension in the room. Yuck exhaled slowly, The storm inside him momentarily quieting, replaced by a steady, cautious determination. They were not healed. The fractures remained. The trust was delicate, and the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger. Yet in that quiet, suspended moment there was clarity, and with clarity came the faintest spark of possibility. Outside the city continued its relentless rhythm, oblivious, indifferent. But inside the apartment, the fragile beginnings of reconciliation were forming, delicate, tentative, and real. Youngik and Jim sat together, bound by history, mistakes, confessions, and the uncertain promise of understanding, ready to navigate the long, difficult road ahead. And though the night was deep and the shadows long, for the first time since the discovery, a false sense of hope flickered in the darkness, unbroken and persistent. The following morning arrived with an almost cruel brightness. Sunlight spilling through the blinds and illuminating every corner of the apartment, making the shadows from the night before seem like distant memories. Yuk remained near the window, leaning against the sill with arms folded, the light catching the subtle lines of fatigue on his face. The air smelled faintly of coffee and the lingering scent of late-night tension. An invisible residue that made the space feel both familiar and alien at the same time. Jim sat across the room, still, wrapped in the threadbare blanket, eyes fixed on the floor. The morning light reflected off the moisture at the corners of his eyes, a reminder of the previous night's confessions and tears. Every subtle tremor in his hands betrayed the anxiety that still gripped him, the fear that the fragile bridge they were attempting to rebuild could collapse with the slightest misstep. Youngik broke the silence first, his voice low and deliberate. Last night was the first step, but steps alone aren't enough. We need to confront everything, every fear, every secret, every impulse that led to this. We can't just move forward blindly. Do you understand that? Jim nodded slowly, voice barely above a whisper. I understand, he said. And I'll face it, every part of it. No more hiding, no more lies, not even to myself. I've lived in shadows long enough. It's time I face the light, even if it burns. The apartment was still heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions and the fragile hope of reconciliation. Yuk felt that weight pressing against his chest, a mixture of exhaustion, anger, and the faint glimmer of empathy that refused to be extinguished despite everything. He knew the road ahead would be arduous, filled with moments of doubt, confrontation, and perhaps even despair. Yet, there was a sense of necessity in continuing in, facing the storm rather than fleeing from it. Then, we start by being honest, Youngik said, tone firm but not unkind. Not just with each other, but with ourselves. Every thought, every fear, every impulse that's been buried, we confront it. No excuses, no rationalizations. Do you trust yourself to do that? Jim's gaze lifted, meeting Youngik with a mixture of fear and determination. I'll try, he said, voice steadying slightly. It won't be perfect. I'll stumble, I'll fail, but I won't hide anymore. Not from you, not from myself. The morning sunlight shifted as the day progressed, shadows lengthening and retreating in the corners of the room. The ordinary rhythm of life outside, cars passing, people talking, distant sirens contrasted sharply with the intensity of the emotions within the apartment. Youngik observed Jim studying the subtle changes in posture, the twitch of a shoulder, the bite of a lip, the way his eyes lingered on a point in the floor as if it held answers. Every detail was significant, a window into the complexity of the person before him. A person who had betrayed trust yet sought redemption with a raw honesty that was almost unbearable to witness. You need to understand something, Youngik continued, voice low, almost reflective. This process, it's not linear. There will be setbacks. There will be moments where anger or doubt overwhelms us. And there will be times when the temptation to retreat into silence will be strong. But if we're to rebuild, we have to endure it. We have to face it together. Jim swallowed hard, a subtle nod acknowledging the gravity of the statement. I understand, he said softly. And I'm ready, even if it's painful, even if it takes everything I have. I can't keep living in the shadows of my mistakes. I have to face them, and I have to face you. Every part of me, no matter how ugly, no matter how shameful. The room was silent, for a long stretch, filled only with the faint sounds of the city beyond the windows. Youngik exhaled slowly, letting the tension ease slightly from his shoulders, though the storm within him was far from resolved. He realized that the process of trust, of rebuilding what had been fractured, was not just about forgiveness. It was About understanding, confronting the darkest parts of oneself and each other, and navigating the complex landscape of human emotion without succumbing to fear or avoidance. He stood and moved to the window, resting his hands on the sill, the sunlight warm on his palms. "Well, take it one step at a time," he said finally, voice calm, but carrying weight. "Every truth, every confrontation, every uncomfortable moment, we face it together. And if we can do that, maybe, just maybe, we can rebuild what's been broken, stronger than before. But it will take everything we have." Jim watched him, a faint glimmer of hope breaking through the layers of shame and fear. "Then we start," he whispered. "No more hiding, no more pretending, no more running from ourselves." As the day deepened into afternoon, the apartment, once a space of ordinary routine, had transformed into a crucible of truth, emotion, and raw human connection. Every object, the sofa, the scattered papers, the floorboards beneath their feet, bore witness to the unraveling and tentative rebuilding of trust, each moment laden with significance, each word heavy with consequence. Youngik and Jim sat together, bound by history, betrayal, confessions, and the delicate possibility of understanding, ready to navigate the uncertain and often painful path toward reconciliation. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the intimate reckoning occurring within the walls of the apartment. But inside, the air was charged with potential, tense, fragile, and real. Youngik could feel it in the subtle shift of Jim's posture, in the careful way he met his gaze, in the quiet acceptance of the long road ahead. They had not healed, they had not reconciled fully, but they had taken the first essential steps toward facing the consequences of their actions and the fractured truths that now defined their bond. Even as night approached again, casting long shadows across the apartment floor, there was a sense of cautious hope. The fractures remained, the trust was delicate, and the path ahead was fraught with challenges, but it existed, tangible, real, and waiting to be navigated with honesty, courage, and the commitment to confront the darkness rather than retreat from it. Youngik exhaled slowly, eyes closing briefly as he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The city outside continued its relentless rhythm. But here, in this suspended space of confession and tentative reconciliation, two friends sat together, bound by history, mistakes, and the fragile promise of understanding. They were not whole, not yet, but the journey toward repair had begun. And in that realization, amidst the tension, guilt, and lingering fear, there was a fragile flickering spark of hope, unbroken, persistent, and quietly enduring. Night deepened outside, the cityscape glimmering faintly under scattered street lights, while inside the apartment, shadows crept along the walls like living tendrils stretching over furniture and floorboards that had witnessed too many unspoken moments. Youngik sat on the floor, leaning against the sofa, eyes fixed on a single point in the dimly lit room. His thoughts were a chaotic tangle of the previous days. Revelations, each memory, each confession replaying in endless loops, Jim's tremulous voice, the raw vulnerability etched across his features, the moments when anger and disbelief had threatened to overwhelm him entirely. Jim remained on the couch, a thin blanket draped over his shoulders, hands gripping the edge as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the present. Every slight movement, every shift of his body, betrayed the undercurrent of fear that still coursed through him, the constant anxiety that any misstep might undo the fragile equilibrium they had established. And yet within that tension there was a quiet determination, a willingness to confront the storm he had unleashed, to endure the consequences of his actions, and to attempt the impossible, rebuilding trust where it had been shattered. The silence stretched heavy with unspoken words, until Youngik finally broke it. "We can't just keep pretending this is manageable," he said, voice low, measured, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. "Every choice you made, every secret you kept has consequences that ripple far beyond what you can see. And now we are forced to confront them." Jim's head lifted slightly, eyes glistening in the dim light. "I know," he whispered. "I realized that now I wasn't thinking beyond myself. I thought I could contain everything. I thought I could manage the impulses, the obsession, the shame. But I was wrong. And when you saw me, I understood what I had done. How much I had endangered not only myself, but everything we've built." Youngyuk's chest tightened, the tension in his shoulders palpable. The apartment, once a place of comfort and routine, had become a crucible in which every fragment of their relationship was tested. Every unspoken fear brought to the surface. He felt anger, yes, and betrayal. But beneath it all, there was a persistent thread of empathy, an acknowledgement of the courage it took for Jim to lay himself bare, to expose his flaws and fears without reservation. You need to understand what trust means, Youngik continued, voice low but sharp, carrying the sting of hurt and the weight of expectation. It's not just a word, it's a foundation. And when it fractures, every action, every secret, every omission leaves a mark. You fractured ours. Now we have to decide whether we can repair it or whether the fracture defines the rest of us. Jim lowered his gaze, shoulders slumping slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of guilt and understanding passing through him. I understand, he murmured. And I want to repair it. I'll face every doubt, every fear, every anger you have. I'll endure whatever it takes. I know it won't be easy. I know it may take everything I have, but I can't live with the weight of hiding anymore. I need to face the truth, even if it burns. Youngik studied him, the tension in his chest softening slightly as he absorbed the sincerity, the fragile determination, the vulnerability that was both terrifying and compelling. The air between them seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a mixture of fear, regret, and the tentative spark of hope that persisted despite the wreckage. Then we face it together, Youngik said finally, voice quieter, now reflective, carrying the slow gravity of someone who had been pushed to the edge yet refused to retreat. Every uncomfortable moment, every confession, every confrontation. We endure it step by step. No hiding, no avoidance, no shortcuts. We face the truth, and only then can we see if the pieces can fit back together. A long silence followed, heavy but not oppressive. Jim nodded slowly, a small, but significant gesture of acceptance and commitment. Step by step, he echoed softly. No more shadows, no more illusions. I'll face everything myself, you, and the consequences of my actions. The city outside continued its relentless rhythm, oblivious to the fragile, intense reality unfolding within the apartment walls. Every passing siren, every distant car horn, every flicker of neon from the street below contrasted sharply with the quiet intensity of their shared space. Youngik and Jim, bound by history, mistakes, and the raw necessity of truth, navigated the delicate terrain of trust, betrayal, and redemption in a suspended bubble of time, where every word, every glance, every subtle gesture carried profound significance. Youngik exhaled slowly, letting the tension in his shoulders ease marginally. Though the storm inside him remained, he realized that this was only the beginning. The true work lay ahead. Confronting each hidden impulse, each fear, each lingering moment of doubt would take hours, days, perhaps months. It would require honesty that cut deep, patience that stretched thin, and courage that neither of them had fully measured until now. But despite the weight of it all, there was something undeniable, a thread of connection, delicate yet persistent, linking them through history, shared experience, and the unspoken understanding that neither could abandon the other without fracturing themselves in the process. Jim shifted slightly, breaking the
silence with a soft voice, trembling but resolute. I don't want to fail again, he said. I don't want to hide anymore. I want to face it all. Even if it's painful, even if it scares me, I need to try. Yukkuk's gaze softened, the faintest flicker of hope weaving into the mixture of fatigue and tension that had taken residence in his chest. Then we try, he said, tone calm, deliberate. Together, step by step, we face the darkness, the fear, the mistakes, and we see if we can build something stronger from it. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And if we fail, at least we'll know we faced it honestly, without rare, without lies, without pretending. The lamp grew cast long. Soft shadows over the part, creating a subtle chaos of light and dark that mirrored the complex terrain of their emotions. Outside, the city continued in indifferent rhythm, unaware of the intimate, arduous journey unfolding in the quiet apart above. Youngak and Jimn sat together in that space, fragile but connected, ファシング・ザ・ロング・アンサーテイン・ロード・アヘッド・ウィズ・テンタチベ。カーレッジ、レディー・トゥ・ナビゲート・ザ・イントリケート・ダンス・オブ・トラスト、コンフェッション、リコンシリエーション・ザット・ウッド・ディファイン・ゼア。人生は前へ前へと進み、時間は二の次となり、無意味になった。1分1秒が長くなり、1時間がぼやけ、それでも重みは。共通の真実、告白された秘密の重大さ、そしてかすかな希望のきらめきが消えることはなかった。息をするたびに、視線一つ一つ、言葉一つ一つが彼らが進むしかない道への一歩一歩の決意となった。その童貞は平坦でも単純でもなかったが、それは彼らのものであり、これまで経験したことのないほどの存在感、誠実さ、そして忍耐力を必要とした。その静寂の中で、一瞬の沈黙の後、ユングクは深い何かを悟った。過去を消し去ることなどできない。亀裂を完全に元に戻すことなどできない。そして、成功。しかし、一つだけ大切なことがあった。後退も回避も幻想も抱かずに、すべてに立ち向かうという決意だ。誓う。その決意は、脆く、不確かなものであったが、救済、理解、そしておそらくいつか。以前よりも強固な基盤の上に信頼が築かれた。夜はさらに深まり、影は長くなり、街は。外の明かりは暗い水面に映る遠くの星のようにきらめいていた。ユングクとジムンはアパートに残った。過去の重圧、現在の激しさ、そして、先行きの不確実性。亀裂は現実のものとなった。信頼は、繊細ではあるが、試され、緊張し、生々しい絆は影に耐え。壊れたものを回復力のある、本物のものに変えるためには、慎重かつ計画的なステップが必要です。